So, good afternoon, everybody. I will continue here on the lecture about international migration, and you're talking about the proposed southern border wall in the US. I just want to start the class, I received some emails from students saying that they're having trouble with the quizzes, and I emphasize that I will give a total of 4 bonus points, as I have said before in class, and as I have explained in the syllabus as well. And some of these bonus points will be given through short essay questions, so not the quizzes. But another thing that's important to explain is that the quizzes, they come from the same question banks that I use for our exams. So the same group of questions that I put on Canvas, from which Canvas randomly selects the questions for each one of the students, these are the same places where Canvas is also selecting information for the exams. Probably what's is happening is that people really concentrate and study a lot before the exam, so they tend to do better. And if you're not going on that pace throughout the semester, so the chances of getting both questions correct on the quizzes, it declines. And some people are saying that they're having problems following the classes online. The setup is complicated. And if you are in College Station, just remember that you can come to the classroom. The classroom here has capacity for 85 people, and right now in the classroom there are 2 students, and lately we have been having most of 4 students in these last months, like in October and since mid-September. And I also see I have the record of people who are participating and attending the classes on Zoom. Right now there are only 14 people, and we have 71 students, so 15 now, plus 2 in the classroom. And I see that my lectures on YouTube, on average, they are like only 15 views. And some of the views are me testing to see if the video is correct or not. So there is not much that I can do. I know that's a difficult time to study and all that. There is a lot of stress going on, but still, we have some standards that we have to follow. And the questions from the quizzes, again, they come from the same question banks, from the same group of questions that we use for the exams. And I could use quizzes, like from the rules that I have since the beginning of the semester, quizzes since I could go back to the topics since chapter 1 for the quizzes, but I have not been doing that. I have been selecting questions related to the topic that we are studying right now. So I'm not creating really difficult quizzes. If you have come to that class in the last week and in the current week, the questions are related to usually those times, those classes. But one possibility that I'm thinking is, instead of giving only up to 4 bonus points, is to give more than 4 bonus points, so that I could do it, so I can give it more. And it's going to be either through short essay questions or the same quizzes with multiple choice. And the short essay questions, remember I mentioned that already. If we have a short essay question for one day, for one assignment, it's going to be just one question, and then you have around 15 minutes to answer it, okay? But for the multiple choice questions, it's going to be the same style of 2.5 minutes for each question on average. Okay, so, and if you guys are having any issue understanding the topic, you can unmute yourself and ask questions, right? And I'm open to answer. And I have been saying to people by email, try to read the slides and try to read the textbook before I talk about them in the classroom. Because if you read them before, and the slides, as you know, have been available in our websites since the beginning of the semester. If you read these slides in the textbook before, the chapter in the textbook before, you will better understand what I'm talking about. Your notes will be better. So take notes. Students who take notes usually do better on quizzes and exams. And you should also ask questions. So usually students who study more have more questions, right? But there is not much that I can do if not many people are right now, 5 minutes into the classes. Right now it's 3:20. There are 16 people on Zoom and 2 in the classroom, 18 people in total out of 71. And 18 people plus 15 that might watch on YouTube. So it's only 33 people. So it's like less than half of the class is actually coming to the lectures. Okay, or watching in some way, either live, even in person, or through Zoom or on YouTube. But it's much easier to blame the professor than to blame ourselves. That's an easy thing to do. I was a student most of my life. So now I will continue here on this topic about the current government building the southern border wall, and this is really related to international migration. This is pretty much a policy that has been suggested by the current federal administration. And there are a series of people and demographers trying to understand if this proposed border wall would work. And the same author from our textbook, Dudley Poston, he has been writing some articles and using scientific data to see if it would work. And as I mentioned at the end of the last class, in the US, we have 44 million foreign-born people based on data from 2018. Out of these 44 million, almost 11 million are undocumented. And out of these 11 million, around 4.5 million are visa overstayers, people who enter the US with visas, tourist visa or student visa or some other kind of temporary visa, but they just stay even after their visa expired. And around 6 million people entered the US without inspections. So we have two kinds of undocumented immigrants, as I mentioned in the previous class, the visa overstayers and the ones that actually enter through the border in some way that they are not inspected by the Border Patrol, or they use fake documents, right? They are called the EWIs. And the southern border wall would cost over $21.6 billion. So that's a lot of money that the government would have to take from taxpayer people to build this wall, which is pretty much a public policy in the sense that you are taking money that came from tax revenues for the government and use that to implement the policy. And anyone who is a policymaker or is interested on the government being more efficient in the way that it uses money, we should think about policies that actually use this money in a smart way, in a way that actually work to accomplish the results that you are trying to achieve. And the main argument from these studies here is that the southern border wall would not work. And based on what kind of data and scientific information they're basing that? Based on historical evidence. So other countries throughout history tried to build these border walls and pretty much didn't work. People kept coming in, even with these physical constructions throughout the border. And actually, most of the people entering the US now that are undocumented are actually visa overstayers. So they're not coming through the southern border. They are coming with visas and they are overstaying their visas. So they are not entering without inspection. And another point is that usually migrants, people who decide to come from other countries to the US, as we have been talking before, there is some selectivity going on. Usually are people who are healthier, they have better social network, they have better information about how to cross, and they will eventually cross the border, right? So there is all this selectivity in terms of the migrants are actually better educated, have better socioeconomic status, and have better skills than the average of the population from their home countries. And other arguments against the need of having a southern border is that the foreign-born people, they have lower crime rates than the US-born population. And those people who entered without inspections, actually they don't take jobs from the US-born population. And then in the next subsection of this lecture, I'm going to go through in more detail about that, the economic effects of immigrants in the labor market. So I'm just going to go through these different aspects here. Virtually all the famous walls in the world did not or do not work. A really famous wall in the world is China's Great Wall that took almost 2,000 years to build at a cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. And it actually consists of series of different walls through China. And the China's wall did not keep out foreigners throughout history. So Mongols entered China and ruled China in the Yuan dynasty between 1279 and 1368. The Manchu also entered China and ruled China in the Qing dynasty between 1644 and 1911. And Dudley Poston has even more analysis about other walls that we know throughout history, showing that they do not work. And a famous one was pretty much the Berlin Wall that divided Berlin between Western and Eastern Berlin, and still people were able to cross even with all the surveillance that existed in Germany at that time, right? Another thing, the majority of undocumented immigrants enter the US right now with a valid visa. They overstay the time limit that their visa allowed to stay in the US. And they do not come through the southern border. They come usually through the airports. They present their passport with the temporary visa, tourist visa, work visa, or student visa. Usually those that overstayers are more people who overstay their tourist visas. So they are not coming through the southern border. If you construct the southern border, the visa overstayers will keep coming. And actually, if the US had a biometric system that would monitor people entering, exceeding the country, that would be more efficient than a border wall in the south. So a biometric entry-exit system would monitor people entering and exceeding the US. It would reduce the number of visa overstayers because then you could track where these people are, if they left, if they didn't. And actually, the Congress mandated an electronic entry-exit system more than 20 years ago, but it has not been implemented exactly because of objections of the tourist industry and other groups, because they think that if we have this electronic system, it would prevent people to come to the country, and that would hurt the tourist industry in the US. So if the US had this system implemented, that would be more efficient and cheaper to prevent people to enter the US undocumented or overstay their visas than constructing a border in the southern, in the border between, constructing a wall in the border between Mexico and the US. And another major thing, the selectivity of migration. We talked about that before, about the push and pull factors in migration. When most of the migration to a specific country is driven by the pull factors of the destination country, so the US is attracting people to come to the US, why? Because the US is a great country, because the US has really good job opportunities, the US has a really good possibility of the second generation to improve their lives compared to the first generation. Even the first generation immigrants, unskilled, if they do the same jobs here in the US, they will make much more money on average than if they stayed back in their home country, and they can even actually send money back to their home country through remittances. And the second generation, by going to public schools here and growing up and already learning English since children, they will increase their socioeconomic status and educational attainment compared to their parents. So the US attracts all these migrants because of all the good qualities of the country. So it's all, the migration to the US is more related to the pull factors that make people come to the US. And that makes all these positive aspects of the US that attract immigrants, the immigrants to the US are positively selected. So they tend to be better educated. They tend to be have higher levels of skills compared to their home population. Maybe they have lower skills on average than the population in the US, but higher than in those countries of origin. And after they enter the country and they have children, their children will tend to have similar levels of educational attainment and socioeconomic status as the US-born population, or even higher, right, than the third plus generation. The second generation, the children of immigrants, have a really good mobility opportunities for them. So they are really positively selected in that case. And they are usually more highly motivated in terms of economic activities, looking for jobs and being entrepreneurs and opening small business and stuff and all these different economic activities than the average population of the origin countries. And usually immigrants in the US, they have higher rates of opening their own businesses than even compared to the US-born population as well. And usually only the strongest and the most advantaged people attempt actually to cross the southern border from Mexico to the US. A wall, of course, will make the journey to the US more dangerous. A lot of migrants will fail, a lot of them will die, but eventually most will succeed. And Douglas Massey, I already mentioned him to you here, mostly in the lecture about theories of migration. He's a professor in the University of Princeton and one of the most recognized demographers in the US and works on international migration. In several of his papers, but this one specifically, he mentions that a wall will cause immigrants to settle and stay in the US and not return to their home countries. So what happens is that if you increase the border security, once people enter, they will not go back, they will stay in the US. And before, when we had the Bracero program, before 1968, the male workers would come and then go back. And now they come and stay, and they come with their whole families, and then they move to all areas in the US. And what's interesting too, is that in these studies, they show, yeah, it's more expensive to cross the border. The chances of dying increases when you increase border security, but the probability of entering the country will not change. So you increase deaths, you increase the cost of these migrants, but they will eventually enter, right? And these are statistical models that they are using data from all different sources and controlling for all different factors, right? So you can check out this paper. And exactly on this paper, in the previous one, he mentions specifically that in 1986, exactly with the Immigration Act that was implemented that year, there was an increase in border enforcement. So it was a massive policy intervention undertaken for domestic political purposes, but these increases in border enforcement in the southern border was not was not actually trying to understand the scientific reasons why people were entering. They were not based on analysis of forces driving migration. It was all related to political purposes. Politicians, pundits, and bureaucrats continue to call for more border enforcement. And they continue to call for more border enforcement, and this proposition of the southern border wall goes in line with that, even though since 2008, the net undocumented migration has been zero or negative. Undocumented immigrants going out and going back to their home countries, and those ones entering, it's either zero net migration if you subtract the ones entering by the ones leaving, or even negative. There are more undocumented immigrants leaving the country than coming in. And one important thing that these studies have been emphasizing is that these policies are not based on scientific evidence. They're just based on political ideology, based on all these different public discourses that are not really trying to understand the reasons, the drivers of migration. Even when policies respond to changes in immigration, they are usually not based on understanding the driving forces of international migration. These policies are usually shaped by economic circumstances, political ideologies, and symbolic significance of immigrants. And usually these immigrants are portrayed in the media as invaders, as the caravan of immigrants, or as people who will increase crime in the country. And this is not just in the media, this is also in the discourse of politicians and legislators. So you have all the symbolic, even the use of the word, the words and the adjectives that are used to qualify these immigrants. It's all used in this public discourse as a way to say, oh, we have to control immigration, right? And what's interesting is that the increase in border security in the southern border actually have exactly the opposite effect as intended. The restrictions on work permits turn legal migrants into unauthorized migrants. However, family preference systems prevail, which encourage no workers to migrate. What does this sentence here is related to? This is really related to the end of the Bracero program. With the end of the Bracero program, immigrants cannot enter the US temporarily to work and then go back to their home country. So, and you do not have enough legal or enough visas being provided to migrants. So, but these social networks, the desire of people to come to the US, it did not start in 1986, has been there for decades before. So they will continue to enter. But since they don't have the possibility of getting a temporary visa or any other kind of visa, they come as unauthorized immigrants. And exactly because they have family preference, they are trying to provide better life standards for their family. So increasing border controls affected the behavior of unauthorized migration from Mexico. That's exactly what I was talking about, the circularity. Border enforcement discouraged circularity. Before, people could come, work with a temporary visa, and then go back to their home country. And they could just come like the male worker, if it was the case, and then they would go back to their family. And now undocumented immigrants are encouraged to stay because there's so much security in the border that's harder to cross, but once these people cross, they will stay. And they come not just a specific worker from the household, but the whole family. So before the increase in border enforcement, you had this circular flow of male workers going to mostly three states, California, Texas, and Illinois. And after the increase of border enforcement, now you have around 11 million people living as settled families, the whole family, not just the male worker, the whole family living in the US and not just in these 3 states, but living throughout the nation. And of course, everything changed. Now we have an increase in female labor force participation as well. Everybody in the household is working or studying. But the point here is to say that you have circularity before, and now you have these settled families living in the US and not just concentrated in specific states. And this is just to show the unauthorized immigrants as a share of the foreign-born by states. So taking the foreign-born population, each one of these states, as the denominator, and putting the numerator, the undocumented immigrants. We have this rate here of unauthorized immigrants divided by the foreign-born population in these states, and this is data from 2008. And you see the states with the highest percentage of undocumented immigrants. Here is like little, not intuitive, it's like the light gray, we have the highest ones, and then the dark gray, the high percentage of undocumented, lower percentage of undocumented, and lowest percentage of undocumented in dark blue, right? So this is just to show that now we pretty much have higher concentration of undocumented population all over the states, controlling for the size of the foreign-born population in these states all over the US. These states in light and dark gray, okay? Another thing is that we usually hear in the media politicians saying that these immigrants crossing the southern border, unauthorized, they increase the crime rates in the US. They are rapists, they will increase violence and all of that. But the data shows the opposite of this political discourse. The foreign-born people have considerably lower crime rates than the US-born population. And another criticism about undocumented immigrants, all these undocumented immigrants are bringing drugs to the US. But the thing is that the most illicit drugs don't enter the US via the immigrants that are entering without inspection. Most drugs smuggled into the US do not arrive on the backpacks, on the backs of those that are crossing undocumented. They are coming the drugs actually through the regular ports of entering the US. So in 2015, the US Drug Enforcement Administration reported that Mexican drug cartels bring most drugs over the southern border through ports of entry via trucks, passenger vehicles, and tractor trailers, really through those long lines of people trying to come to the US through the regular ports of entry. So it's not through undocumented immigrants trying to cross the border by foot, right? So they're not coming with their backpack full of drugs and smuggling. It's not how it works. This is how it works, through the regular ports of entry. And another thing is that the legal and undocumented international migrants to the US are less likely to commit serious crimes and to be imprisoned compared to the native US-born population. Yet, in the public discourse, as we hear from politicians and the media, immigrants have been perceived as threats in political and public discourse, right? And if we look at the generation of immigrants, and this is the first generation, those that are born outside the US, and those include both legal and undocumented immigrants. Second generation are those that are born in the US and their parents are born outside the US, and native born are those born in the US and their parents born also in the US. So this is pretty much the prevalence of each one of these groups involved in at least one crime in the previous 12 months. And this information is by age. So of those, they have the same pattern. It increases from 12 years of age until around 16, and afterwards starts to decline for all the groups. But you also see a difference in level. So those immigrants born outside of the US, they have much lower chances of committing crimes compared to their children who are born in the US. The second generation actually has higher chances of committing crimes that are similar to the native-born population. So these are rates already taken into account the size of each one of these populations. And people usually say, oh, but In this case, we're talking about rates, right? We get the number of first generation in the denominator and then put in the numerator those that committed crimes. They say, oh, but we should look just at the numerator, not at the rate. So people try to actually mess up with the statistics, but the fact is, in this case, you really have to look at the likelihood of those people committing crimes. So you have to control for the size of this population, the denominator, and the numerator, you count those that committed crimes, and much lower among people born outside of the US. And all this discourse, the public attitudes, perception towards immigration, and questions about the social and economic impacts of immigrants are really linked. If I have the perception that immigrants are dangerous to the country, they present a threat to the country, I will think that those immigrants will also be bad to the socioeconomic accomplishments of the country. So that's why these perceptions and these public discourses are really important, because these discussions, these public discussions in the US really shape the way that we think that policies should be done. But the fact is that these public discourses are not showing this kind of data that I'm showing to you here. And that's the thing. That's what's important for us, to take advantage of being at the university and look at data and digging up as much data that we can. And this previous data comes from the Pew Research Center, really respected, that collects a series of surveys, and you can check out their surveys. It's not just about immigrants, about several different topics in the American society, but really reliable data, and we learn a lot from the US from these surveys. The fortunes of immigrants and their effects on the economy, political systems, schools, and society shape public opinion on additional immigration. So if we see undocumented immigrants actually integrate into the country, you tend to have a positive view of them. But if in some case, those immigrants, they are treated, they are, in the public discourse, they are qualified as being a threat to the society, that will shape the public perceptions of people. And the public discourse usually links undocumented immigrants to terrorism. But the fact is that terrorist attacks have not been committed by undocumented immigrants. So this table here was organized by Scott Savitz, who is a researcher at the RAND Corporation. The RAND Corporation is the research institute. The main headquarters are in Santa Monica, California. I worked there before coming to A&M, but they also have headquarters in Washington, D.C., in Pittsburgh, Boston as well. And Scott Savitz, what he did, he was pretty much saying, oh, okay, all these different terrorist attacks that we had in the US. What was the condition in terms of visas or residency of the people who committed those attacks? So they are pretty much, they lawfully enter in the US with their visas, or they were residents of the US. All these different attacks here that were committed in the US. In these ones here, the shoe bomber, the liquid explosives bombers that were not successful, and which is good, they were actually carrying concealed explosives in the airplane. So they had visas to come to the US. Some of the hijackers of 9/11, they were visa overstayers. So they did not cross through the southern border. They overstayed their visa, some of them. And no terrorist attack has happened because of undocumented immigrants coming through the southern border. There were some visa overstayers, but not from those coming from the southern border, undocumented. Okay? So this is data based on facts, but the discourse usually links immigrants and terrorism and undocumented immigrants coming from the southern border to terrorism. And that's not what's going on. This is not what's happening in the country. And another discussion that I will go more in detail in these next slides here is that undocumented immigrants entering without inspections, they do not take jobs from the US-born population. Almost all people entering the US without inspections, they perform work Americans don't want to do. There is little evidence that EWIs harm or suppress the employment or wages of the US-born population. And I include a series of readings as extra readings in the course website. And actually, it's not in the next section of this lecture, just the next one now, about that actually there are series of economists, the majority of them showing that these undocumented immigrants that entered without inspection, they are not stealing the jobs and they are not competing in the labor market with the US-born population. And another thing is where we say, oh, these people, they are coming to the US and they're taking advantage of our system, of our benefits and so on. But the fact is that about half of these immigrants that enter without inspection, they pay taxes. For example, in 2015, the IRS received more than 4 million tax returns from workers without Social Security numbers. And many of them are exactly undocumented immigrants that entered without inspection. And they paid almost $24 billion in income taxes. And because of their status, because they are undocumented immigrants, they cannot get back any of these benefits through Social Security or Medicare payments. They are not qualified to those. They are not qualified to the Affordable Care Act, to Social Security, to Medicare, anything. But they are paying taxes, right? That is going to the American population or to the US-born population, right? So just going a little further, a little deeper on this subject. Immigration raises concerns that the US-born workers might experience negative impacts on their earnings because of competition from these immigrants. And the main concern is exactly with those American workers with lower levels of education. These US-born workers with lower levels of education might experience an increasing competition for low-paying jobs with immigrants and refugees. So that's the main concern of these studies. So the question is, does an increase in labor supply, exactly now, these immigrants, low-skilled immigrants, coming to the US, increase the supply of labor? Do they have a negative effects on labor outcomes of competing low-skilled native workers? In this report that I already mentioned to you, it's a report of like 500 pages, is available for free. It's centering this topic of integration of immigrants into the American society. It was funded by the National Academies of Science. And the two coordinators, Waters and Pino, are the ones that are cited here. And this data and this information comes pretty much from this report. They are saying that there are no definitive answers because numerous or concurrent effects are related to economic outcomes. So it's not really clear that immigrants really hurt the labor outcomes of US-born population with lower levels of education. It still is a controversial topic, but what I'm going to show here now are most of the results that we see on this topic. So there are different results. In one side, usually we hear Jorge Borjas. He's a professor in Harvard. And he says that immigration reduces the wage and labor supply of competing native workers. So immigrants with low levels of education come to the US, compete for jobs with low-skilled US-born workers, and the US-born workers lose their jobs. So his main finding is that wages of natives decreased by almost 4% when there was a 10% increase in the labor supply of immigrants. This 2003 chapter is one of his most, it's a really highly cited chapter that he paper that he has on this topic. And this 2016 is a book called We Wanted Workers that's cited at the end of this presentation. In this book, We Wanted Workers, that presents exactly this, has been cited a lot by the current federal administration as a final proof that low-skilled immigrants takes the jobs of low-skilled US-born population, right? So the current federal administration uses a lot, cites a lot the work by Jorge Borges. But there are a series of other economists that do similar analysis and look at similar data. And Perry is one of the most known among them, but also Taviano and David Card, that I'm going to talk in the next slides. They say that immigration had a small effect on the wages of native workers with no high school degree between 1990 and 2006. And actually, immigration had a small positive effect on average native wages. Hey, it's the opposite then. People with low skill come to the US, they get those really low paying jobs, and the US born population that has been working those low paying jobs, they move on in their career. They actually, because they know English, they have better social networks, they will get better jobs. So there's actually a positive effect on average wages of the US born population with low levels of education. What's interesting of this finding is that this immigration of low-skilled workers had a substantial negative effect on wages of previous immigrants in the long run. So recent immigrants with low skill, low education, they are actually competing more for jobs with immigrants that came to the US more like further in time, like many years ago. So the competition is in between immigrants with low skill, not with low-skilled immigrants with low-skilled US-born population. I'm going to keep talking about this now. David Card, a professor in UC Berkeley, he mentions that a lot of these different results that we see in the literature related to this topic about the economic effects of immigrants is due to different methodological approaches pretty much. He pretty much says, what's the assumption of these studies about immigrants increase the demand for more production in the labor market? So when we talk about immigrants entering into the country, the first thing that is this discussion bringing to our mind is that immigrants with low skill, they will compete for jobs with other low skilled US-born population. But these low skilled immigrants will also bring something else. Will bring an increasing demand. They also buy food, they also buy clothes, they also look for houses, they also buy cars. So they are also consumers in the labor market. And if they are, okay, looking for jobs, but they're also spending their money in the labor market, the market as a whole will have an incentive to provide more resources, to produce more. So if these studies take into account that the market will invest more capital in producing more because now you have a higher demand, if studies consider that companies will adjust production for this increasing demand of people buying more goods, the effect of immigration is approximately zero. If I make a simple model in which I consider that companies will not invest more capital, the negative effects of immigrants on labor markets, it's verified. And Borges, he's clear on saying that actually he says that investment of businesses in producing more because now there is a demand, he maintains that constant. He's just varying the supply of workers, not the demand, the supply of immigrants that increase the supply of workers. He's not looking at the changes in the demand for more goods that these immigrants bring. So that's why he tends to find more negative effects of immigration on the labor outcomes of the US-born population. But if you say, in the medium, the long term, or even the short term, these immigrants will consume in the labor market. So we have to produce more. So businesses will produce more, we invest more, and then you actually have. And what happens if you have a lot of immigrants coming to the US, low skilled? They will compete for jobs, okay. But they will also buy, like I just said, food, They will look for housing, cars, and everything, clothes and everything else. So businesses will have to increase production. By increasing production, what do they need more? Workers, right? So supply of workers increase the supply of demand for goods, and the increase in supply of demand will actually give more jobs for these workers. Not only these immigrant workers, but to US-born workers. That's the main idea. Even the way that these studies, they subdivide education groups. If these studies, they subdivide education into high school dropouts, those with a high school diploma, some college, these immigrant dropouts have lower relative wages. The immigrant dropouts, those immigrants that have less than high school, they will compete for jobs with the US-born population that did not complete high school. And then the wages of this US-born population that did not complete high school will drop. But the reality of the labor market in the US is pretty much, you usually get a job based on whether you have or not a high school equivalent degree, or whether you have or not a college equivalent degree. Those are the points that businesses are trying to hire people. And if we focus on these groups that actually matter to the labor market, it's more aligned to the reality of the American labor market, earnings have been largely unaffected by immigration. And another thing as well, another assumption, if we try to compare immigrants and natives with low levels of education, and we say, oh, they are equally, they have similar qualities in the labor market, so they have equal competition. That's the assumption that we are using. So yeah, you're gonna see negative effects on wages. But if you take into account that although these US-born workers, they have lower levels of education, but they have some other advantage, such as they have better language proficiency, they have broader social networks, they have more friends, more family, more people in order to find other jobs, then you're going to see positive effects on the outcome of natives. Exactly what I said before. Maybe those low-skilled immigrants get those really low-paying jobs, and these US-born workers that have low levels of education, instead of doing those jobs, they will go up and get better occupations that require better language and require better knowledge about the economy. So actually here you see positive effects on the earnings and labor outcomes of the US-born population if we increase immigration. And this is data from 2006, but this is just to give an idea of the long-term fiscal effect of one immigrant, and the amount is in dollars, in thousands. Just saying that if you have immigrants coming with without a high school, with a high school, more than high school, and these are all immigrants. So immigrants coming without a high school diploma, they tend to have a negative effect on the fiscal, a negative effect on the American economy in the fact that they are getting more than they are providing. But this changes substantially by the second generation, the children of those immigrants. And this number here is pretty much this one minus this number. If you increase the education attainment, actually all these results tend to be positive. So these immigrants are producing more than consuming. And if you look at the overall result, the negative result of all immigrants is really, really small, not statistically significant, okay? Oh yeah, this is based on a paper from 2006, but the data is even older. It's from 1997 in this case. And an important thing here, natives experience occupational upgrading and specialization as an adjustment to immigration flows. Exactly what I was talking before. They know English better, they have broader social networks, so these immigrants come and take these low-paying jobs. The US-born population with low levels of education will improve their occupation. While immigrants tend to concentrate on manual jobs due to language and cultural limitations, the US-born population leave their previous occupation to work on more complex jobs, which pay more. This pattern generates improvements in native wages and mobility without negative effects on unemployment for unskilled natives. So it's exactly the work by Patty that I mentioned before, and David Card and Ottaviano and Fodge in this case as well. Countries with larger immigrant competition experience a move of the native workers to more sophisticated skills with higher incomes, which require higher education levels. Natives engage actually more entrepreneurial activities in response to larger immigrant competition. Open immigration policies, I know that's really controversial in the US, tends to then generate better career opportunities for natives when combined with a flexible labor market. So the data is going, all the scientific evidence is going exactly against all the public discourse that we hear from politicians and from the media. So models should take into account the skills of workers and capital to assess the effect of immigration on the wages of workers in the long run. So we should take into account not just short-term impact on the labor outcomes of the US-born population. We should take into account the long-term effect that then takes into account an increase in the demand for more products to be made in the US. The reduced form analysis that includes only skills does not give a complete information about the wage effect on immigration. These partial estimates are only the effect of direct competition, but it's not taking into account that the businesses we see, oh, we have more people that want more housing, more food, more clothes, more cars, more everything, so we produce more. In order to produce more, they have to hire more people. That brings more work for the US-born population. The total wage effect is also determined by indirect complementarities among different types of immigrants and natives. So it's not just the competition for the job. By coming more people to work, they will have more demand for produce, and then you create more jobs. And overall, immigration to the US had a modest negative long-run effect on real wages of the least educated natives. So this effect was in between being actually negative, minus 2.1%. But if we look at the confidence interval, it goes from minus 2.1% to plus 1.7%. So that's a result that's not statistically significant because the zero is in between here. So the confidence interval contains zero, which shows that there is a possibility that immigration actually doesn't have a negative effect or even positive effect on the earnings and the labor outcomes of native workers. This economist here, Clemens, he wrote this really interesting article on Vox, which is available in this website here. You can look at it. And he's talking about this Marriott boat lift event that happened in Miami in the 80s. For a few months in 1980, 125,000 mostly low-skilled immigrants entered Miami from Mariel Bay, Cuba. So at that time, a lot of Cubans were trying to get out of Cuba and come to the US. And the Cuban government had all the restrictions of Cubans leaving Cuba and coming to the US. But for a few months, Fidel Castro said, okay, you guys want to leave Cuba and go to the US? Just go. So he briefly lifted Cubans' ban on immigration. And 125,000 low-skilled immigrants entered Miami from Cuba. So, okay, you want to go? Just go. And what happened? Then the American government was like, hey, calm down. Let's try to organize the system here. But these 125,000 workers, that's not a small number. The workforce of Miami rose by 8%. And usually with normal immigration, the nationwide workforce increased by 0.3% per year. And in this case, increased 8% in a few months in 1980. So if immigrants compete with native workers, Miami in the 1980s is exactly where we would like to see drops in wages. If immigrants are competing for the same jobs with the native population, then you're going to see really steep drops in wages. And this is one example of a natural experiment. What is a natural experiment in social science when we talk about that, or in sciences as a whole? Natural experiment is when something happens in society suddenly that we are not expected. And then it has effects on several different socioeconomic, demographic, and health outcomes of the population. In this case, it was pretty much a decision, a political decision by Fidel Castro. He said, okay, you want to go, just go. I will lift all the ban on immigration. And then you have this process that changes from one day to the other. The 2008 economic recession was one kind of a natural experiment as well. In the order of this 1-2 years, a lot of people lost their houses, a lot of companies went bankrupt, and it changed suddenly the labor market. What we are happening right now in the US and in the world actually then, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, suddenly you increase mortality from one semester to the other, and that has a huge impact on mortality, on health outcomes, on morbidity, like the incidence of diseases, but also on economic outcomes. So the pandemic is seen as a natural experiment that affects socioeconomic, unemployment is increasing and so on, and also health outcomes. So what Clemens does in this article, really nice and a really straightforward and easy way to understand, he kind of says, okay, I'm going to get the data, like a representative sample for the US, in this case focusing on in Miami, the current population survey, and I'm going to do the estimates like all these other economists did before. And I will do like all of them did, including the estimations by Borges. And I want to see if this increase on immigrants in Miami in 1980 really reduced the wages of the US-born population. And he starts the paper by saying, David Carr, the one that I mentioned before, the professor in UC Berkeley, in the 90s already had found no difference in wage or employment trends between Miami and other cities. This was true for workers, even in the bottom of the economic skills ladder. Mariel immigration had essentially no effect on the wages or employment outcomes of non-Cuban workers in the Miami labor market. Jorge Borges, the one that I mentioned before from Harvard, in his book, We Wanted Workers, found the opposite, found that this influx of immigrants in Miami dramatically reduced the wages of native workers. Immigration critics, those that don't like immigration, said, oh, yeah, now a professor from Harvard found the truth. Immigration hurt the wages of US-born workers. The debate is settled. But then what Clemens does in this exercise is to get the same data, similar data that all these researchers are using, and use their specific methodology to see why they got different results. So he starts by looking at it. Here first, you see that the Mariel boat lift happened right here. Before that time, the wages of the workers was already going down in Miami. So it was already going down. These wages here are estimated with the current population survey, which is a survey, not the whole population answers. It's representative to the population of Miami, but we are not interviewing everybody. So there is a chance that we have a measurement error here. So the confidence level, the confidence interval goes from here to here. That's the 95% confidence interval that we hear a lot during elections, like right now that we are saying, oh, we expect that this candidate is going to get around 40% of the vote, but it can vary from 37 to 43%, for example. That's the idea of the confidence interval here. The confidence interval exactly because we get a sample, not the census from the population. Who are exactly of those workers that we are looking here? These are workers in Miami, low-skilled wage earnings, those with high school or less, from 1983 to 1987. And when we look at these groups, we have around 185 observations per year in each one of these years here. And what do we see after the Mariel boat lift? If we say, okay, you have all these immigrants, low-skilled immigrants entering the US, what's going to happen is that the US-born low-skilled workers will experience even steeper drop on their earnings. But what happens? The opposite happens. After the Mariel boat lift, instead of this trend going even down, it actually stabilizes. It's exactly the opposite. And even if you look at the confidence interval, the lower bound of the confidence interval is above this linear trend. So it's pretty much saying that actually after the Mariel boat lift event, the overall earnings of this population here, of US-born workers with less than high school or less, actually improved. Improved because this lower bound of the confidence interval doesn't touch the linear trend. So there is no sign of a dip in low-skill Miami wages after the huge arrival of low-skill Cubans in 1980. And what now Kleeman starts to do is to break down these results for different subgroups of the population. So here he's just considering males. When you break into subgroups of the population, what happens? The sample size decreases. You had 185 when you consider only males in the same high school or less, US-born males. The sample size decreases. But still you see, there was already a decline on overall real earnings before the Mariel boat lift, and after all the entrance of low-skilled immigrants from Cuba, again, their earnings became less negative. In some years here, it's not actually different from what it was before, but in some of these years, they're actually better. They stopped declining. Among Hispanics only, non-Cubans, the same thing was negative, and then after the Mariel boat lift, it stabilized a little bit. Or in some cases, it's just following the same trend as before. If you take only workers in the prime ages, those ages that usually people have higher earnings, between 25 and 59, workers with low skill in those ages that have higher earnings. And then you have a big sample size, 142. Negative, and after the Mariel boat lift, those US-born people actually experience a stabilization on their earnings. So there is no sign of a dip in the low-skill Miami wages for subgroups of workers. And if you look at only US-born workers with high school only, and the other side less than high school. Just go back 2 slides before, you had 185 high school or less. Just subdivide this 185 into these two groups, high school only and less than high school. The ones with high school only, actually, it was declining, but after the Mariel boat lift, stabilization of their earnings. Maybe because now with more immigrants in Miami coming to Miami, they're not only competing for jobs, they are also looking for products to buy, to eat, to wear clothes and everything. And then the market is going to have to create new jobs that probably is actually hiring these people that see a better situation on their earnings. If you look at the US-born workers with less than high school, the trend did not change. maintain the same. There's no sign of a dip in low-skilled Miami wages, even when we divide workers on high school or less than high school. Indeed, on less than high school, continue the same. High school only, even improved the trends. And then here, finally, he replicates the work of Borges. Borges said, we have to look at a really specific group that would be hurt by these low-skilled immigrants coming from Cuba. And these are US-born workers, men, non-Hispanic, between 25 and 59 years of age and prime ages, and less than high school. And then you finally see the dip. You finally see the dip here, some years after the Mariel boat lift. The trend was negative, but then it becomes more negative. So there is a sign of a dip in low-skilled Miami wages for the subgroup here of US-born workers, male, non-Hispanic, 25 to 59, less than high school. What's the problem of the model by Borges? Sample size. He broke it down so much for that small group that the statistical significance of this analysis is really, really, really not reliable anymore. You have only 17 observations per year between 1983 to 1987. Only that. So only when he threw away 91% of the data, he saw the sign of the dip. He saw the sign of the dip. So his work is all based on a subgroup of the population that has a really small sample size, that even if we are not breaking down by subgroups, a small enough sample size, we should have at least 20 observations or 30 observations randomly selected all across the city of Miami, considering these characteristics. This is really not reliable analysis. And this is all the work that the current federal administration is talking about, right? So if you understand it, you can better counter-argument. Just read this paper here. It's not a dense methodological read. It's just really interesting. He goes on to explain each one of these graphs, like I tried to do here, and giving some more historical background, okay? It's a really interesting article to understand it. So you understand that in this case, that you had a really clear case in which immigration would impact negatively the earnings of the US-born population. You did not see that. You see that in this really small group with a really small sample size that doesn't give any reliable information. And now the last topic on this lecture is about simulating a new US immigration policy, which would be based on a point system. So a current criticism of the US immigration policy is that admissions are not based on a selection of the best and the brightest. More highly skilled immigration is needed to raise educational attainment of the labor force. So we should have a system in which we would actually bring more immigrants based on their educational and their economic skills level, and that would improve the labor force as a whole. However, in this analysis by Van Hook and her colleagues, they mentioned that this logic is not sustained when we consider educational mobility among children of immigrants. These immigrants that maybe they come with low levels of education attainment, their children will actually improve on average their educational attainment right on the second generation. And moreover, this number of immigrants that, okay, it's big if you compare to other countries, it's relatively small if you take into account the size of the American population. If you take into account the size of the American population, these immigrants, they do not change the composition or the quality of the labor force. And if you were to bring more qualified in terms of education and economic skills immigrants to the US, that would not change, that would not raise the skills of the American labor force, exactly because immigrants are a small share of the labor force. In order to come up with these results, these researchers, they did simulations. So they just look at the data that they have now and just do simulations. Okay, let's try to simulate a process that all undocumented immigrants cannot come to the US, and let's just bring people with higher levels of education attainment. So they're just simulating what's going to happen in the future to kind of think about this policy that has been proposed a lot. And this article is also available in this website here in a shorter version, but the full article, the reference is at the end of this lecture. And this one here is a shorter version, also really easy reading. So they pretty much start to compare the immigration policies in the US and Canada. The US system does not select immigrants primarily on their education or skills. A lot of immigrants come to the US because they have ties to people living in the US. They are fleeing political persecution in their home countries, or they are winners of the green card lottery. And some of them are also unauthorized workers. In Canada, they have a point system in their immigration policy. It gives priority to highly educated immigrants. So around 60% of Canadian immigrants have a college degree. In the US, only 30% of immigrants have a college degree, right? So some US policymakers have debated implementing this point system as Canada has one. This RAISE Act of 2017 was proposed by the current administration, was not approved, but the idea, it would have eliminated certain family categories, those ones that I mentioned before, and the lottery program for the green card, and would require employment-based immigrants to enter either with a combination of high levels of education, English proficiency, and earnings, or with really high accomplishments or wealth, like really, really wealthy people. So that was the idea of this act that was proposed by the current administration. So all this debate brings some questions. How much the education attainment of the working age population would change over the next few decades if US immigrants were as educated as Canadian immigrants? The overall working age population in the US, including US born, that would not change anything. What about if all unauthorized immigration or family and diversity admissions categories were eliminated? Nothing would change. And that's the whole analysis that I'm going to show you here. The answers are nothing. It could change that now you have more skilled immigrants, but taking into account the whole US-born population and putting them together with immigrants, that it would not actually increase educational attainment much. So they do a micro-simulation model. The model accounts for the ways the Americans live their lives over time and across generations. And they do the simulations for the years between 2015 and 2065. It simulates immigration scenarios while assuming that all the aspects of life in America will continue similar to current conditions in terms of education, mobility. Second-generation immigrants, they improve their education compared to their parents who were born in other countries. Immigrant assimilation is high in the US compared to other countries. And we still see a lot of racial inequality in the US that has persisted for several years, centuries. So they pretty much say that the share of immigrants that would have a college degree would actually increase. If we have the current policy, it would be around 52% of people between 25 and 64. If we had the Canadian model, it would increase to 67% by 2065. And this is not surprising because the whole policy in Canada that we are simulating for the US selects immigrants based on education. But like I said, this doesn't change the overall education attainment of the whole labor force in the US. Eliminating all unauthorized migration, this is all theoretical work because it's not possible to block all unauthorized migration. But if that was possible in a world that was possible, it would increase the share with a college degree by only 3%. Eliminating family and diversity immigrants increased by only 1%. Family-based and diversity immigrants are nearly as educated as employment-based immigrants, so it would not change much. So overall, even if immigrants arrive with no education, their children tend to go much further. Education attainments of descendants of immigrants tend to be closer to the US-born population. I will continue on this on Tuesday, but pretty much, does the US receive enough immigrants to change the entire labor force? No. The answer is no. The proportion is too small to have an overall impact. Impacts on eliminating unauthorized immigration or the family reunification and diversity categories on the entire working age population would be virtually zero. Right? And I will go more in detail, but pretty much saying that these policies that are being proposed to the US do not work. And just to highlight once again, we have 17 people by the end of the class on the Zoom, 3 in the classroom, 20. Let's see how many people will watch this course on YouTube. Really, really few people have been watching the classes, and people are complaining about about quizzes. I cannot make any miracles, right? If you guys don't study, I cannot do anything about it. And not you guys who are here attending the class, but the ones that are not here, not attending the class in any other way. They will not learn if they don't watch the class either live on YouTube. So thank you very much. Have a great weekend, and I see you guys on Tuesday, Election Day. Thank you.